One of the distinctive things about human life, you and I, is that we have eyes and ears to be able to interact with the environment around us. Computers have the same sort of thing, only we call them input-output ports. These are capabilities of being able to attach keyboards, mouse, other things that actually allows data to flow into the system and flow back out of the system. It also connects a number of other different supporting devices. One of the things that you need to be able to do as a computer technician and industry professional is to be able to identify legacy ports, in other words, those on older systems that you may encounter, and current ones that are actually being used in most systems today. This will really give you the capability to do well in this particular career.
First, let's just do a brief overview of some of the ports that you are going to probably run into. This is actually the collection of interfaces you're going to see on a typical ATX type of motherboard. First, you have PS2 ports, and these actually allow for connectivity of both keyboard and mouse, and typically are older. You used to have a very large external adapter for a keyboard, but this actually allowed for much better connectivity. Then you have your parallel port, which is typically used for printers. Now, this has been superseded by USB type printing, but at one time this was actually the standard for printing. And the reason why they call it a parallel port is because those different pins that you see actually sent data in parallel, meaning at the same time. And that's in contrast with a serial port. A serial port sends information in a series or one piece right after another, rather than having it run in streams simultaneously. It's typically used for connectivity to external types of devices such as modems or computer devices such as routers and switches. You can actually use this to be able to connect to those. Then you had USB ports, which simply stands for Universal Serial Bus, and it's definitely universal because just about every device you connect to the computer now actually uses this type of a connection. Then you have your 1394A or FireWire ports, which are very, very high speed and can be used to connect external devices that actually require great speed and availability. Of the collection of ports we just reviewed, there are a number that are considered obsolete or legacy. Legacy is actually a collective term that simply means out of date or probably has been surpassed by something newer. However, you may run into these both from an exam standpoint as well as a production environment standpoint. So let's begin with serial ports. These were actually originally used to connect input-output devices. For instance, a mouse or a modem was used to actually connect these. This is actually the cord, a serial cord. You may not be able to find these readily anymore, but it used the DB9 or 9-pin connector. There was also a DB25 that was actually used, which was much larger than this. Same pins actually were used in the transmission process, but you could actually get a DB25 to DB9 adapter as well. You use this to connect modems, as we talked about, the mouse at one time, and then also console connections to network devices such as routers and switches. And it's interesting that these ports were also called RS-232 ports because the RS-232 standard actually defined the electrical timing of signals and the meaning of signals, the pinouts, and so forth in dealing with these particular types of devices. If you have COM ports on your system, you'll actually see them identified in your device manager, and they're labeled. You usually have a finite number of them, typically COM 1, 2, 3, or 4, and there's only a certain number that are available to the system. In newer systems, these have been phased out, and you actually use USB to serial adapters if you're going to use them. And you won't actually see them in Windows Device Manager unless you have a device present and connected. Serial communications are actually controlled by what are called a UART device, UART, Universal Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter. And it translates between the serial and parallel formats. Now again, in older devices you may find these integrated into the motherboard. Now in this particular demo we actually want to talk about the communications port, the serial ports, that are available on laptops as well as desktop computers. Now as I'd mentioned before, the newer types of units don't actually have physical COM ports. Instead, you end up having to use what are called USB to serial adapters. Now the one way to know whether or not you have any COM ports actually available and usable is to bring up Device Manager, and I happen to be using Windows 7. Now as you actually look here, you'll notice you don't actually see any COM ports listed. And that's because, remember, this does not physically have any, but you have to use a converter. So I'm actually going to plug in the converter. And now you actually see that COM ports have shown up. See? USB to serial COM port. And it's also identified as COM port 5. So now we can actually interact with the device that's connected through one of these COM port converters. In this case, we're actually going to use a program called PuTTY. You see here we have several different types of connectivity options. We want to use serial because that's the purpose of a COM port. And if you remember, many devices, if you're actually connecting to them like a Cisco device, which is what we're going to do, you actually have to have some specific settings. Now first we want to change this to COM port 5, 9600, and we want to go down here to where it says serial and actually configure some things for this particular device. So it's COM 5, 9600 baud, which is deadly slow by modern standards. This is what's known as 9600 8 and 1 because it's 9600 baud, it's 8 data bits, no parity, parity is an error checking mechanism, and then 1 stop bit. Now the other thing to think about is you have what's called flow control, and you see there's a number of different types here, and for the device specifically that we are looking at, you have flow control set to none. Now when we go back to the main screen and we open, you actually see the device starting to have some issues. So we're going to reboot the device right here. And now you see it's actually displaying a number of different types of commands. So we have established a successful serial connection to this device, which is a Cisco ASA 5505 firewall. And we'll just briefly let it go through the boot up process to give you an idea of how a serial port connection type of works. This is what's called a console connection because it actually connects to a serial port also on the device. And this just gives you the most basic idea of how you can actually use the COM port on your computer to be able to interact with different devices. And in this case, you could actually do show, and this just is about configuration. You actually show just different things that are going on the device. And this is really beyond the scope of what we want to talk about, but basically the point here is being able to use a COM port to be able to create this kind of connectivity. Next you have parallel ports, which use a DB25 type connectors you actually see pictured here. And usually in legacy environments you had one or more parallel ports. These could actually be integrated into the motherboard, or they could be external types of adapters. You could actually have printers, scanners connected to these, and you could actually have unidirectional or bi-directional communication. And the IEEE 1284 standard actually designated how this worked. Many times they were referred to as printer ports because printers were the most likely device to connect. You actually can see two connectors on the cable that's pictured here. You have the DB25 connector, and then you have what's called a Centronics connector, which is actually used to connect to the printer itself. If you have these available on your particular device, you'll actually see them designated as LPT, meaning parallel port 1, parallel port 2, parallel port 3, and so forth. Another legacy connector that we've already pointed out are what are called the PS2 connectors. You notice they look very similar, but one is typically used to connect your mouse and the other to connect a keyboard. If you've ever had a PS2 system and you've mixed up the connectors, you'll notice that not a whole lot happens. That's usually how you know. They're also color-coded by the colors that are here, and then usually the plug on the end is actually coded with that. So if you have to deal with PS2 connectors, keep in mind. And actually what's pictured here with the mouse is actually a very typical type of PS2 connector, but you sort of catch the idea if you ever run into these. One thing to keep in mind that the PS2 type mouse and keyboard ports are all but phased out at this point. At one time, there was a completely different connector back in the early days of the PC, but the PS2 style ports were very popular, but now everything has pretty much moved to a USB type of connectivity. One of the devices that connects to these types of ports are what is called a mouse. And this is basically a point and click type of feature that oddly enough was actually pioneered by Apple. You had serial mouse devices, which actually were connected to the serial port. Then the PS2 type that we've already talked about. You have a wireless mouse, which essentially just has a wireless adapter in the USB type of port, which I actually use myself. And then you have the traditional USB or wired mouse. Now, another type of pointing device, aside from the mouse that you'll typically see with laptop computers, are the touchpad. And most often with the touchpad, you've got the square type of surface, which you actually use with, for instance, your finger to be able to move around the pointer on the screen. And then you have the right and left buttons. Sometimes you'll actually have some additional controls and so forth. But keep in mind that the touchpad is very common to be the primary pointing device on a laptop. With a keyboard connector, it's very straightforward. Just a typical keyboard. You may have a regular keyboard or some other types. You could see actually how this connects. Very simple and straightforward. And again, it's been surpassed by USB, so USB keyboards are going to be much more common. Keyboards basically allow the user to input text information into the computer. You have alphanumeric special characters, certain function keys, and lots of other things that are available on the keyboard. Typically, you would have a USB connected keyboard, which is what you would run in most commonly now, PS2 type of connection, and then a wireless connection, which is, again, is going to be using USB. Another layout that you might come across is actually what's called an ergonomic keyboard. It's still going to use these type of connections, but the way the keyboard is laid out is quite a bit different and designed to reduce repetitive stress injury, which is essentially carpal tunnel syndrome. Modern ports, and one of the most particular interests to you, are going to be the high-speed ports that are available on computer systems today. I'm going to actually look at the different types, of which there are primarily two. The first is USB, or Universal Serial Bus. And this kind of port has replaced just about all other connection types, particularly the legacy types. In fact, most laptops have stopped using serial parallel PS2 ports in favor of USB ports. Now, there are different versions of USB as follows. You have USB 1.0, which is 12 megabits per second. USB 2.0, which has a capability of 480 megabits per second. And USB 3.0, which is 5 gigabits per second. Now, USB has a couple of interesting characteristics. It actually has the ability to be able to supply power to the devices that are being used. For instance, if you have a wired mouse and you plug it in, it's actually going to be powered by the USB port itself. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. You can actually daisy chain up to 127 USB devices. Now, if you don't require power, it's not a big problem. You can get a series of USB hubs and things like that. However, if you do have power, then you're limited to only 2 devices per port. If you want to do beyond 2 powered devices per port, you have to have a powered USB hub versus just a passive USB hub. Now, to list the different devices using USB would be exceedingly numerous since so many exist, but you can actually think of things such as the keyboard, mouse, wireless, printers, and so many other things, hence the term Universal Serial Bus. And the actual pinout of the USB port looks very, very much like this. And the actual physical port hasn't changed as much as the capabilities of the speeds that are available now. There are different connector types that exist. This is the typical USB type that you're familiar with. These are used, for instance, the type B is what you would typically see on a printer. Then you have your mini types, which are frequently used on cellular telephones. And then you have micro, which is even more compact. And this gives you an idea of the form factors of the different ports that you may run into as a computing professional. The next type of high-speed interface to be aware of is FireWire. Now notice you look at it, it looks sort of like USB, but it's keyed differently. The shape of the port is actually different. Now, FireWire ports are actually high-speed bidirectional ports with numerous applications, including external device support, PC-to-PC connectivity, and so forth. The most common version is 1394A and can be natively supported on the motherboard as well as through installable adapter cards. Speeds are much far in excess of USB and include FireWire S400, 100, 200, or 400 megabits per second, S800, 800 megabits per second, S1600, which is 1.6 gigabits per second, and S3200, which is 3.2 gigabits per second. Very, very high speed. And as was the case with USB ports, there are a variety of form factors in terms of FireWire 1394, 1394A types of ports. You have your 6-pin alpha, which we actually saw designated and used in the adapter cards we were examining. You have your 9-pin beta and your 4-pin alpha, which many times you'll see in laptops. So this just gives you an idea of the different assortments of connectors in the FireWire family of ports. Now, as I mentioned, there is a wide variety of different types of devices that you can use to connect to USB and FireWire type ports. So rather than going through it and listing them all out in redundant fashion, we're just going to touch on some major ones that you might be able to run into, use, and support. First, you have barcode readers. And barcode readers take the UPC, or Universal Product barcodes, and actually translate them into real data. These devices can include handheld scanners and pen-type scanners. They can be USB connected, they can be wireless, there can be proprietary interfaces, but there's a variety of different types of form factors of the devices you may use. There may be proprietary drivers and devices which obviously would come with this product itself, but the idea is you can actually use these to read these particular codes. In fact, Android phones actually come with barcode scanning programs that you download and install using simply the camera. At one time, the UPC was something that was just printed but not used, and now, of course, it's used for all sorts of things. Then you have cameras. And these devices are used to input video into the computer. There's a variety of different types. There's the webcam, which you actually see pictured here. You can actually use digital cameras and so many other things. And these can actually be connected to the computer by USB, by FireWire, and there's just all sorts of different ways that you can actually use this, for real-time video conferencing to being able to take pictures and so forth and so on. Now, the wireless antenna itself is actually in the bezel, which is the area around the monitor output screen, or integrated on the edge of the LCD into the lid. You have digital cameras. You can actually see here you actually have both a USB and a FireWire connection, as well as just some simple video out. And then there's also biometric scanners. This is actually a device used to identify an individual based on the physical characteristic of the person. In this case, you actually see a fingerprint scanner. It could also be voice recognition, retina scan, and this is frequently used for security. These can actually be integrated, as you actually see here, or it can be a USB connected device as well. It's designed to be able to enhance security. It may be integrated into the system, as we mentioned, or it could be supplied through some sort of external device. Then you have touch screens. These have become very, very popular both with smartphones and tablets and so many other things, in which there's sensors that are put on the screen to be able to indicate when that person is touching that particular portion of the screen. In essence, you eliminate the mouse by being able to use the touch screen. This could be used in personal digital assistants with iPads, with the iTouch, kiosks, point of sale, GPS, tablet PCs, smartphones. There's really an entire orchestra of different possibilities that are usable with touchscreen technologies. Now, as the case with a lot of different technical topics, there is more than one type of touchscreen. For instance, there are those that require a stylus. You may encounter these, for example, when you're signing for a credit card type of arrangement, when you've scanned your card and you're going to pay somewhere. Those use actually a stylus. And then there are those that you work with your finger, and those work with completely different types of technologies, and they're different altogether. And the final type of external connector we want to talk about is what's called KVM. And this is a device that allows a user to connect multiple computers to a single keyboard, monitor, or mouse. This is primarily used in data centers, but it's actually quite useful, and it can support multiple rack-mounted servers. Now, you may wonder why they call it KVM. Let's look at the letters K, V, and M. Notice all the connectors that are here. Keyboard, in this case you have the PS2 ports in this particular device. Video, in this case the VGA adapter that we talked about, the port. And then mouse. So KVM actually stands for keyboard, video, and mouse. So just some terms as we wrap up. A serial port, again this is a legacy computer port which sends data, bits, in a series one at a time, also known as COM ports, COM1, COM2, COM3. A parallel port is a legacy computer port which sends data 8 bits at a time in parallel, and typically used for printers. LPT1, LPT2, LPT3, for example. You have USB, or Universal Serial Bus, a high-speed serial interface with broad device support, which has replaced serial, parallel, and PS2 connector types. And then FireWire, the IEEE 1394, high-speed serial connection type, first developed by Apple with speeds higher than USB. These may not be all the ports that you will ever see, but they certainly represent the most common.
So as we've been discussing, input-output ports on the computer are the proverbial eyes and ears of the system. And while it empowers some great capabilities and great technology, you have to remember that all of this computing technology still requires a human touch. And ultimately, that's the reason for this course. You being that human touch that it actually comes to being able to explain these ports, to be able to connect different things and recommend them to end users. There you go.